Well, just then, as they were turning right onto Main Street, my Aunt Lucille, in a very ladylike fashion, broke wind that God's love accepts and delights in us just as we are. My Aunt Lucille and my Uncle John, they lived up in a small, remote mountain town in the Adirondack Mountains called Silver Lake, New York. It was very remote. Still to this day, I don't think they even have cable, let alone Wi-Fi. It's way remote, way up in the hills, just a lot of hunting cabins and cottages. My uncle, my parents actually often would tell us that Aunt Lucille and Uncle John didn't have any couth. They didn't have any refinement because they were mountain folks, good people, holy people, but a little rough around the edges. Well, once a week, Uncle John and Aunt Lucille would come down from their mountain community to the larger town, to Ausable Forks, where my grandmother actually had a grocery store, and they would come into the store for their groceries and their gas and their provisions to live up in the mountains. Anyways, one afternoon, they started down from their home in the mountains to Ausable Forks to the town to get their provisions. And like usual, Aunt Lucille drove. She always drove the Rambler. Most of you don't know what a Rambler is, but it was the junky car that everybody had. It didn't go very fast, and it wouldn't go very far. And thank God most of it was downhill. And Aunt Lucille would drive, and my Uncle John would actually sit in the back of the car. And Aunt Lucille would have Rufus, their dog, sit next to her in the passenger seat in the front. That's just the way they did it. I never questioned it, but I always thought it looked very odd. And as she was driving down the mountain, as she usually does, and probably most of us do this too, she held a conversation with Rufus, the dog, all the way down the mountain. Meanwhile, my Uncle John, who's a very quiet man, just kind of sat in the quiet in the back. And as they were driving down this mountain, really into the valley, the Champlain Valley, into Ausable Forks, just as they reached the edge of town, just as they were driving into Route 9, the main streets of the town, and you could actually see my grandmother's store just maybe blocks away. Well, just then, as they were turning right onto Main Street, my Aunt Lucille, in a very ladylike fashion, broke wind, had some intestinal issues. It was just awful. Well, just then, right then, my Uncle John bailed, opened up the back door, jumped out onto the streets, and landed on the streets. Lucille just kept on talking to Rufus and kept on going. Never even noticed that her husband was in the middle of the street of Route 9. She did not notice his absence until she pulled up to the station and the gas station attendant asked Lucille, "Why is the back door open? And where is your husband?" And there you could see Uncle John just kind of walking down the street, just a few blocks away, just walking down, kind of rubbing his back where he had fallen, and just shaking his head. Later, around my grandmother's kitchen table. My grandmother just came out with it. She was just kind of a matter-of-fact type person. And she looked up at my Uncle John and Aunt Lucille and just said, "How do you two do it? How do you two put up with one another?" Just then, quiet John, he just looked up and he smiled. And he said, "Because I just like everything about Lucille. I just like everything about this woman." And at that moment, I realized just how unconditional his acceptance is of everything that Lucille is and was. I thought, that is truly beautiful. In many ways, that is the heart of today's gospel. That God's love accepts and delights in us just as we are. The good news is that God really truly delights and values us just as we are, in our uniqueness, in our every acceptance. That is how God sees us. That's how we should see one another. Today's gospel reveals a God who not only likes us, but he even embraces and accepts the edgy and the awkwardness of our lives.